We hear a lot of perspectives on the Mankind podcast. Inclusion of a guest is not an endorsement of their views, and the opinions expressed here do not always represent the mission or values of the Mankind Project USA.
What if one of the hardest things for men of a certain age, 50s, 60s, 70s, to admit is that we really don't fundamentally understand what it's like to grow up as a boy or a young man today? I'll be honest, this conversation pushed me. It brought up some of my own blind spots, my assumptions, challenged some fears. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is one of the leading experts on domestic violent extremism. She's testified before Congress, advised the UN. She directs the Polarization and Extremism Research Lab at American University. Her books, Hate in the Homeland, and most recently, Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, pull back the curtain on how gender, culture, and radicalization are deeply intertwined. In this conversation, we talk about how misogyny doesn't just harm women, it also controls men. We explore what it means for boys growing up online, what older men often fail to understand about the pressures young men face today, and how the enforcement of rigid masculinity can become a pipeline to real-world violence. This isn't about blame, it's about responsibility. It's about listening to boys, supporting men, refusing to look away, and calling us in. Welcome to the Mankind Podcast. Hey, everybody, it's Boysen. Welcome back to the Mankind Podcast, the podcast where we break the molds of modern manhood to prove that there is indeed more than one way to be a man. And I think we're doing a pretty fine job. Today, I have a huge conversation that I've been anticipating and looking forward to, and honestly, somewhat a little afraid of. A little? I don't even have to. I've been afraid of this conversation because this is some serious stuff. I'm with Cynthia Miller-Idriss. Cynthia, say hello.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for having me, Boysen. And I hope it's not too, I hope it'll be an easy and fun conversation.
Well, I'm confident that it's going to be a fun conversation, and we're going to go. So let me tell you a little bit about Cynthia Miller-Idriss. Dr. Cynthia Miller-Idriss is a professor in the School of Public Affairs and in the School of Education at American University in Washington, D.C. She is also the founding director of the Polarization and Extremism Research and Innovation Lab, PERIL. She is a Draper Richards Kaplan Foundation entrepreneur and recently served as the inaugural creative lead for the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation's residency program on social cohesion in Berlin, Germany. Dr. Miller-Idriss regularly testifies before the U.S. Congress and briefs policy, security, education, and intelligence agencies in the U.S., the United Nations, and other countries on trends in domestic violent extremism and strategies for prevention and disengagement. She is the author, co-author, or co-editor of 7 books, including Man Up, The New Misogyny and the Rise of Violent Extremism, which we'll be talking about today, from Princeton University Press, and Hate in the Homeland, The New Global Far Right, from Princeton in 2022. She is currently at work on a new co-authored book with Pasha Dashgard on evidence-based prevention of hate-fueled violence. Dr. Miller-Idriss writes frequently for mainstream audiences as an opinion columnist for MSNBC and in other recent bylines in the New York Times, The Atlantic, Foreign Affairs, The Washington Post, Politico, USA Today, The Boston Globe, and more. And there is the indication of why I am so nervous about this conversation, because wow. So, and I was lucky enough to be introduced to you by a couple of men who I know pretty well, Sean Harvey and Mark Green. And it was Mark Green in an event in New York a couple of months ago. He was like, "Oh my God, have you read Man Up yet? Have you read this book yet? You need to go read this book. If you would like, I can put you in touch with Dr. Miller-Idriss." So let's start there. In Man Up, like the basic premise of the book is that misogyny is kind of central, true, critical, and under-recognized driver of violent extremism.
Right.
Before we got into the recorded conversation, you said, and invisible. Let's start there.
Yeah. I mean, and when I say, first of all, thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be in this conversation. And I will say that sort of men's group and men's wellness and men's work communities have been such an important conversation partner in the reception of this book. Mark Green launched the book with me in New York. And last week I did an event with Ted Bunch and Sean Harvey, who's a fellow in our lab, and really just thrilled to be in conversation with you. It's just, I can't think of anything more important than having these conversations together in a way that sees a shared problem and a shared responsibility. And that's, one of the things I want to talk about is that women play a role in this, in the gender policing of boys and men as well. And in the misogyny that is enacted on girls and women, right? So misogyny is a force that is not only about hatred of women, it is about the law enforcement function of the patriarchy and how we police gender as part of that, including, are boys manly enough? Are they acting like a sissy? Are they, right? All those kinds of things too. And we also see plenty of women enacting misogynistic frameworks on girls about what they should be like and how they should be demure or submissive or aren't feminine enough, right? So that kind of gender policing happens too. So that's partly why we have to have this whole conversation together, I think, because it takes all of us to change it. But the invisibility, I call it a blind spot, just like a driver's blind spot, right? So in other words, it's something that's there that you can see if you look directly at it, but you can't see it when you're looking forward, basically. You kind of have to look over your shoulder, and then you're like, oh, this thing was there all along. And for me, this is my 7th book. It's ridiculous that it took me this long to see it. So I start the book really with sort of an acknowledgement of that and an apology to the field for not seeing it. I spent my whole career interviewing and doing focus groups with boys and men in and around violent scenes and neo-Nazi scenes, mostly in Germany for the first 15 years, and trying to understand better educational responses to these surges of violence. And I would talk to them a lot about things like brotherhood and belonging and their desire to be a part of something bigger and better than themselves. And the pressure they felt to be willing to fight, ready to fight at all times, right? That kind of stance. And the ways that they felt compelled to be provocative, to be rebellious, right? So all these kinds of things that might be characteristics of manhood or becoming a man when you're 16, 17, whatever. And I also wrote a lot about women's roles in these movements as they enable and support and participate in white supremacist movements in particular. But I never once asked any of those men or boys how they treat women or their own experiences of gender policing or bullying. It just didn't occur to me. And I think that was just the biggest oversight in my career. And finally realizing it and starting to look at this data, which is, once you read the data in the book, it's like how can you not believe that it's there? It's just every case essentially has some sort of gendered history to it.
Yes. So we'll go up a level again. So back to misogyny. So misogyny is one of those words that many of us men get triggered, activated by. Yeah. So talk a little bit more about how you define that and how you understand it.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why it can be a triggering word is because colloquially and by a lot of people in the public, it's used to mean hatred of women. And so being called a misogynist or saying that you are misogynistic implies that you categorically hate women and have this antipathy toward and are inherently violent or angry toward women. That's not the way I define it. I think it can mean that. There are people who are that. But what I think it's a better definition of it is what the philosopher Kate Manne put forward. And she said, look, patriarchies, which are really a system of power distribution, right? That's what they are.
System, not men, not women, system.
Right, no.
Yes,
it's a system, right? It's a system of power relations and power distribution in which some men, not all men, some men get more power than women and some other men, right? Essentially, right? That's men who are taller, right? Men who are, there's a whole bunch of features that are, that adhere to a kind of patriarchal norms about manliness, are the one. I mean, you never see a president who's not over 6 feet tall, right? We just don't. There are criteria here that are totally unfair to men too. But patriarchies, those systems are upheld by a couple of different principles. One is sexism, which is a set of attitudes that has established that women are either less capable than men for different reasons, so couldn't open a bank account by themselves until 1974, or are devious and not to be trusted, right? And that's a sort of set of beliefs about women too. And then the other part of that upholds patriarchy is misogyny, which Kate Mann defines as the law enforcement arm of patriarchy. It is the way that we police gendered norms and expectations. And that's the way I define it. And it means that we're policing those gendered norms and expectations on everybody. And women and girls experience more of that in terms of catcalling, belittling, right? Different actions that police, but also that try to put them back in their place. But boys experience it and men experience it too. And that kind of gender policing to say, you're not doing gender right. You're not living up to these expectations of what it is to be a man or a woman. And so we're going to try to put you back in your place. And so either you're not submissive enough, or you're not manly enough, you're not masculine enough. And so you get called gay, or you get called a sissy, or you get told to man up or not cry, right? Those kinds of messages happen to boys too. And so if you define misogyny in that way, much more expansively, you can see the bigger set of issues at the system and the cultural level that we have to address, not as individuals who are, hating each other.
And I think it's a good place to say, right? Can I, as a guy, kind of take a step back, get a little bit of distance enough from the culture to be able to see, I'm not being told I'm bad. I'm not being told I should be ashamed. I'm not being told I'm broken. I'm not being told that masculinity is broken. I'm not being told that all men, the kind of all men, anything.
Right.
We are all subject and swimming in this system.
Absolutely. And, and I will say, because I have been accused, even in a recent talk, of having too much empathy, right? So there's like this word that comes from feminists, right? Also, and I consider myself a feminist, and people sometimes get mad when I frame it this way. And, even though I think that's wrong, that really men should be held accountable, as if that doesn't mean that men who are violent toward women, or who do harass or stalk or sexually assault, don't need to be accountable. And I think we can talk about accountability and calling out. Ted Bunch says this all the time, but it's never going to work if we don't also call men in and to participate and lead these conversations. I think it's most important. I was in Champaign, Illinois at an event, a book event, and I ended up spending a lot of time talking to this law enforcement officer on campus who has started running trainings for fraternities that have adapted Jackson Katz and Mark Green's trainings a little bit, right? And Jackson Katz, a friend of mine too. Great. Yes. And we just, he's doing a Q&A with me around the book. We just finished it. So that'll be published soon. Stay tuned. And he starts off in the fraternity sessions, and he does them for sororities too, but he does them separately. And the fraternity session, he kind of starts out asking them to list all the ways that they, in the last 24 hours, all the things they've done to keep themselves safe from sexual assault. Right. And so they basically, and then he puts a phone a friend. He calls one of the young women in a sorority, and he asks them to do it. And, he's prepped the girls, and they list out 12 things, that they do, keep their keys in their hand in the parking lot, or, don't come home after dark, or, make sure a friend has the Uber app, whatever. And so it's just one of those examples to say, look, there are different experiences in the way misogyny and gender-based violence are enacted that change the way you live your daily life. That doesn't mean all men are bad, or all men are dangerous, or all men are violent. And there's certainly a lot of good guys standing on the wall too, of course. But it means that when there's a culture, understanding that cultural experience of being more vulnerable is important, and sort of changes the way. And these fraternity guys loved the training, and they want to bring it national. So it's pretty amazing.
That's beautiful. Thank you for all of that. And I love the idea of talking about accountability in a complex way.
Yeah.
In the Mankind Project, accountability is one of our core values. It's one of the things that we talk about a lot. And one of the kind of core principles that we run with is it's really hard, if not impossible, to hold a guy accountable for something he didn't agree to or understand in the first place.
Yeah, right.
Right. I'm going to hold you accountable to an agreement that I take for granted, but that you and I have never talked about and has never been brought to the surface. Right. So that's the calling in.
Yeah, right.
That I think Call to Men really defines really well.
Yeah.
Hey, can we together look at this?
Exactly.
How do you feel about this?
Yeah, I mean, I'll tell you, my favorite thing that happened this year was I talked to a lot of high school students, and I mostly talk about how gendered content gets delivered to them algorithmically in ways that might shape their views of becoming a man or becoming a woman, right? Whether that's pro-anorexia content or looks maxing content from, whatever it is, but just understand how fast it happens, even when you don't search for it, that somebody's often selling you something, that kind of stuff, right? So afterwards, when I give those talks, almost always it's boys who surround the front of the stage. We also talk a little bit about violent porn and the impacts on behaviors, so a lot of that kind of consumption of different types of content. And I love the fact that it's usually boys that want to talk first, because to me that says, okay, we've created a space where they can do that. And so a bunch of boys were at the podium, and one of them started talking to me. And so I at some point said, well, what do you think that adults don't know that you wish they knew about being 16? About being a 16-year-old boy. And he said, I don't think people understand what it's like to suddenly realize the world sees you as dangerous. And, it was so profound. And then this girl right next to him, who was also waiting to speak, said, well, I don't think boys understand what it's like to realize suddenly that you're seen as a sexual object. And I said, maybe the two of you should be having this conversation together. And then they asked if they could start a club at school, right? Like to have these conversations about their gendered experiences. And I said, if you start that club, I'll come back in March. And so it looks like Mark Green and I are going to go back to that school together in March. They've invited him as well to see if we can work it out, and so I think that, to me, that was one of the most inspiring things that happened, because both they're reflecting and sharing how each one of them has had a hard time understanding what's like when you shift from being a girl to a woman or a boy to a man, and the world sees you with a kind of stamped identity or stamped, role, whether that's as a sexual object or as a dangerous threat, right? And they perceive that. And I think we have given more space to girls and women to talk about that, especially in the post-Me Too movement, what those experiences are. But we haven't really created those spaces for boys to reflect on it. And they feel it just the same. And they also feel the way they've been put in these man box cultures, but they haven't had a lot of space to talk about it. So I think the work of the men's groups and men's wellness worlds to start these conversations is phenomenal, because every boy I've ever met and young man is happy to talk about it, and sometimes thanks me after the interview, right? Like, thank you for asking me these questions. Nobody's ever asked me this before. When did you know you were a man and not a boy? Right. And we have that conversation. It's a really interesting question, right? To hear boys talk about, like 17-year-olds, 18-year-olds.
What's it like to be you is such a profound question.
Right.
It's such an opening question.
Especially right now, when gender is such a dividing line in the way that kids and young people and all of us experience our lives online. And so, the content we get is just so gendered. And that's part of the story, I think, of social and political divides and polarization.
Great. In that beautifully unpack the idea that's in the book of violent retrenchment of traditional masculinity or traditional patriarchy. So how is this? Now let's look at long trends.
Yeah.
Right. How are we in a time where these kind of ideas are getting really retrenched into the culture?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things going on. I do think there's been some backlash to the Me Too movement. And because, to be fair, to men, a lot of men did get this feeling and were told basically that they're inherently bad or dangerous. Like that's a message that men have told me anyway, that they have experienced or felt. Maybe not all men, but this sense of that is there. And so there's some resentment around it because men and boys have also been subjects of sexual abuse and bullying and harm and violent physical abuse at the hands of other men. And that doesn't really come into the story. And because, of course, it's not all men, right? And so that gets really frustrating, too, I think, to a lot of men who then, if they don't find the right outlets to have these conversations, may be tempted by TikTok or Instagram Reels or whatever it is that's telling them, hey, this is not your fault. Feminism has gone too far. Women's rights have gone too far. And then there's this kind of scapegoating narrative that happens that can be very persuasive especially if you're young and there's these influencers, also, waving around their fancy cars and wealth and mansions and, and making it seem like this is the path to success, to adulthood. And so, I think that's one part of what's happening. I think there's a second part of it, which is that it's been kind of mainstreamed at the political level. And I mean, we have to say, when I have a Secretary of Defense saying something like we need male standards, in the military, or when you hear, after the Charlie Kirk assassination at the memorial service, something like we need muscular nationalism, right? These kinds of muscular patriotism. I can't remember what the exact word is, but these sort of references to a kind of reassertion of manliness, plus, of course, some political appointments that have happened with people who have histories of domestic abuse or credible accusations or lawsuits that were settled for sexual assault, and a president who was caught on tape saying all kinds of awful things about what he can do and who he can touch and where. And so there's a kind of normalization at the political level that when that calling out happened at the media and mogul level, or among athletes or prominent in the Me Too movement, this kind of moment of retrenchment, I think some of that is a retrenchment of that, hey, we're going to surge and reseize power. And that's not just happening here. That is a part of the authoritarian kind of playbook, if you will. It's in Hungary, when Orban took over, the first thing he did when he attacked the universities was shut down gender studies and women's studies, right? And attacks on LGBTQ communities are part of these authoritarian playbooks in plenty of places that have dictators instead of democracies. And one of the reasons that happens is because people in leadership positions or aspiring to leadership positions who are not real supporters of democracy know that the fastest way to weaken a society is to divide people along gender lines. And so if you can polarize people and you can get them to be mad at each other, right, racial and gender lines, basically, then you can persuade them that a strong man is the better solution. And so that's been very successful in a lot of places that have non-democratic regimes now. Venezuela, Iran, the Taliban, right? You have that kind of reassertion happening, Russia. And in fact, the last thing I'll say about that is there's a high percentage of bots and trolls that have made gendered attacks on women political leaders too, that don't come from American URLs, that come from overseas. Yeah. And so, it is in someone else's interest to do this, to make men feel like they're being accused, that they're being told they're dangerous, and to make women be attacked and harassed. And when 90% of the attacks on Hillary Clinton, I think, originated overseas, on the gendered attacks, that, whatever you think of Hillary Clinton, that tells me someone else's interest is at stake here.
Yeah, that there's something else at play.
Yeah.
The idea of the brittleness of these concepts is kind of coming to me in here too. And that's one of the things. Let's talk about what it's like to be a man online these days, or what it's like to be a girl online these days, where any man, and I see this a lot, right? Any man who actually sticks his head up to kind of say, hey, wait a minute, hold up. This is not the kind of community that I want to be creating. These are not the kind of relationships I want to be creating with men or women. This is not the kind of world that I want to be living in. It's very, very fast.
Yeah.
That the algorithm will start shutting that down again. Right.
Yeah. It is incredible, isn't it? And, and so I do think there's what we what we perceive as normal, it gets really skewed very quickly because we're getting content that is delivering us sort of opinions and views that are more salacious, more outrageous in performative ways than what people really believe on the ground, because outrageous, salacious, and performatively mad content moves faster. So some of the platforms have, for example, given as much as 5 times the weight to the dislike button as the like button.
Oof.
So if you dislike the content, you actually are 5 times more likely to get more content like that. So reacting, because they know disliked content keeps you more engaged, you get mad. And that's the formula for keeping advertisers happy. So, when you start to look at that and you think, okay, you're actually better off not disliking it, even though, people might feel like, hey, I'm standing up, I'm disliking this video, but then you're more likely to get videos like that. And so that's one of the things we try to help teenagers understand is like the whole system, again, is set up. And it's not, I spend a lot of time online too. Of course we all do. But the whole system, you have to understand with some skepticism, is set up to keep you mad, essentially, and to make you mad, either, it doesn't matter who you're mad at. You can be mad at, diversity, at immigration. You can be mad at women. You can be mad at men who supposedly take all the good women, right? There's all kinds of ways to be mad as long as it keeps you scrolling. And so I think that's something to really unpack and think about how, other than just unplugging, which is not the solution, I think, right? For most of us, we have to think about how to be skeptical of that and of how it's kind of subtly changing the way we think.
Yes. Let's go into an uncomfortable, difficult part of the conversation here to talk more about kind of extremist action and violence that is related to misogyny.
Yeah.
And we've kind of put it out there, not all men, not all this. And now let's talk about the kind of those men who.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
So talk about basic misogyny, basic sexism, violent misogyny, and how those relate to actual large scale violent movements and violent actions.
So there's sort of 2 or 3 things happening at the same time, right? So one, there is this subset of the violent extremism spectrum who are men who deliberately target women with real violent animosity because they are women. And so that is the violent incel community or the misogynist incel community typically. And so we've seen attacks on like the sorority in Santa Barbara, the yoga studio, the van attack in Toronto. There have been about 50 deaths in the US at the hands officially of incels. But even guys like the shooter at the Parkland High School who had praised the incel shooter in Santa Barbara right before he committed that shooting, is not going to be identified as an incel because he didn't leave a manifesto or something that indicates that. But there's still this kind of incubation part of that can inspire. So, there's that happening. But so that's part of it. There's a chapter in the book on that. That is the part that I think is acknowledged by my side of the field, the national security space, as a threat, and that tends to get talked about and discussed and sometimes even makes it into like classification systems or warning signs. What's not really discussed very often is the fact that almost every mass shooter that I can think of across any ideology has a history of, so 60% of them have a documented history of domestic and intimate partner violence. And most of the rest have some history of stalking, harassment, rape threats, sexual assault, anti-LGBTQ violence, something that is a prior act of documented gendered harassment and harm. And so that is, as a red flag or warning sign, totally invisible. Even in the FBI's list of 22 concerning behaviors before a mass shooting, gender isn't mentioned a single time, which is kind of, you have to work hard not to do it, right? Like they have a category that's called interpersonal problems, right? Like, well, who do you think the interpersonal problems are with? Like, it's probably with their girlfriends or, like before a mass shooting. Half of mass shootings, one of the targets is a partner or lover, right? And everybody else is just collateral damage, right? And so when you start to, and then like, of course, 98% of mass shootings are at the hands of men. So you start to see these kinds of patterns and understand that gender and, and so I'll say, there's some of this is just nasty to talk about. So forgive me for saying something nasty, but even in, mass shooting attacks where the targets are not women, are not, and there's no official motive that's discussed, like the Charleston shooting in a church, for example, that killed 9 African Americans. While he was enacting that shooting, in the middle of the shooting, he said, "I'm doing this because y'all are raping our women." Right? So there's this kind of gendered underpinning to it that's foundational. In Buffalo, in Pittsburgh, in El Paso, all of those shooters were totally obsessed with white women's reproductive rates and blamed feminism as part of the reason why white women aren't having enough babies. They also blamed Jews, and then they targeted ethnic and racial minorities for the same problem of demographic change. And that's why that was their motivation. But feminism and women's non-reproductive rate sufficiency was part of the story. So part of what I try to say is, look, like, we are attending to some parts of this in terms of the motivation, but not to others. And if we would address some of these issues of who has control over women's reproductive functions, and the last thing I'll say about that is that to my surprise, when I started doing the research, the first thing that I learned about the data is that among the top 3 predictors, or in some countries, the top predictor of support for political violence or willingness to engage in it, is hostile sexist attitudes or misogyny, depending on how it's defined by the researcher. So it's a big predictor of whether people think political violence is acceptable. And yet the media, when you think about the Melissa Hortman assassination in Minnesota, one of the things that was so frustrating to watch that is it keeps getting described as an attack on progressive politicians. But those politicians were chosen because of their views on abortion and on LGBTQ rights. And among the hit list that he had included Planned Parenthood clinics and other kinds of, so it was a gendered attack. It was a gendered motivation. But we just don't have a way of framing that because there's no category for that type of motivation. It's not like white supremacist extremism or environmental extremism because we don't see it or classify it as a category. So instead, they get described as just progressive politicians who were targeted. And so I think once you start seeing it, you kind of can't unsee it. And then you're like, oh my God, it's everywhere.
There is, I'm kind of going up and down in the intercultural competence work. One of the frameworks that we use is to talk about what levels of dialogue are we at. Yeah. So is this a personal thing? Is it interpersonal? Is it small group? Is it institutional? Is it cultural? And I'm kind of reflecting on like the individual, and there's some media, they want to push it all down to the individual level, right? It's just, this is a mental health issue. This is somebody who is off-center. This is somebody who's da-da-da. But how are we being influenced by culture, by the big picture things, to be in a space where I am afraid of losing my position, whatever perceived position of authority that I may have or not have, or I am in grievance about the fact that I don't have position and I want to achieve something, or just absolute existential nihilism.
Right.
Like nothing means anything. Why? But there's up and down the spectrum of how we interrelate with people. Yeah. And it seems like we need to be doing interventions at both places.
Totally. Yeah. I think actually it's one of the more hopeful parts of the book and of the conversation. In my lab, we have a whole portfolio of work on preventing gendered violence, which includes a program on men and boys and includes a program on anti-LGBTQ issues, and then includes mapping online misogyny and a program on the connection between gender-based violence and violent extremism across countries, right? So not just an American issue. And one of the things we know is that actually, like, there's a huge role to play in everyday life here, obviously. Like, if you're, this is the easiest place to intervene is in your own home, on your soccer team or your dining table or in your youth group, right? Like, whatever it is, where there are young men and young women, you can have these conversations with them and help them understand And that's, I think, so much of the work of the men's groups and men's wellness world is really changing the trajectory that keeps men in these boxes, that keeps them, unable to access the full range of human capacities and emotions, and then, makes people more vulnerable to scapegoating, fear mongering, kind of backlash narratives that say something's being taken or stolen from you. And so I think that's one major way, but we also have to have systems that recognize, categories, red flags, warning signs, for example, that make it more visible. And I think, the visibility, the invisibility of this in my field and the national security space is really dramatic. And so, it's so hard once you see it. I mean, I'll just give you one other example. It's a horrific example. If you read chapter 5 on exploitation, we have regularly, there's a dozen reports from the UN and the International Criminal Court on Islamist abuses of women as part of their core operational extremist group goals, right? Yazidi women, Nigerian schoolgirls, right? All that. We all know about it and we talk about it in the regular, but that doesn't exist for white supremacist groups here, even though the same things are happening. And so we know that white supremacist groups are running prostitution rings as part of their criminal activity. We do not, and I talk about that in the book. I document some of the affidavits that a journalist turned over to me where you could see it documented and no criminal charges were filed, because there's no reason to file those charges if we can get the same sentencing on drug enforcement, racketeering, and weapons trafficking charges, drug trafficking charges, even though the DEA itself says where there's drug trafficking, there's sex trafficking, right? There's a almost 100% overlap between the two. So last year when 63 neo-Nazis were arrested in California and this ring was broken up of the Aryan Brotherhood, and they were arrested on racketeering, drug trafficking, and weapons trafficking charges. And there's one little line in the media coverage that says the hostage negotiation team was also on hand to assist. And, that's it. I was like, well, who do you think the hostages were? Let's think about it for a second, right? Let me guess, because the DEA says where there's drug trafficking, there's sex trafficking. So I have a pretty good guess at who the hostages were. But the media doesn't make it visible. The, law enforcement, there's no enhancement charge. So we don't have a way of making the data visible and those types of things. And certainly my field doesn't see it. So part of the book's purpose is to make that connection a little clearer. If the number one thing that Americans are concerned about right now in recent polling is political violence. First time it's ever been higher than the economy. And if one of the top 3 predictors of political violence is misogyny, why wouldn't we address it, right?
Entitlement. Right. There's the word that comes to mind, right? The first thing is this, there's a protective mechanism that even if I don't like it, even if I don't, it's the kind of overall sexism thing, the overall patriarchy. Even if I'm not an active participant in doing the actions, I am still getting some benefit from the results of the system playing this way.
Yeah, it could be that. I mean, and some of it, maybe a slightly kinder view, in my view, would be to say it's just so invisible. Even when you see it, you have to see it 50 times to see it, right? It's so I'm saying, okay, misogyny is the biggest predictor or among the top 3 predictors of support for political violence and willingness to engage in it. But you have to say that so many times before people are but, oh yeah, the other 2 are racism and xenophobia, right? And so we see the racism and xenophobia, but we just oh yeah, the misogyny, right? Of course there's misogyny. We're all used to it. Everybody experiences it. And so I try to put in the book a whole bunch of little anecdotes that just also explain how it can become so invisible, because you can get so used to it. And that experience, both as a man and a woman, I think you just get used to the fact that catcalling happens, or that, ordinary kinds of things that you just stop thinking. I mean, when the Uvalde, Texas shooter was arrested and, it was found to have later been threatening teen girls online on the regular, kidnapping and rape plots. And a journalist asked the teenage girls why they didn't report it. One of them said, why would we report it? It's just how online is, right? It's just the cost of doing business. For a lot of women online is that experience. And so if that normalization happens, it makes it invisible, right? You can't, why would you report it? It's just the way it is.
And there's a self-reinforcing kind of, is tautology the right word, right? It's like men are dangerous, therefore we need dangerous men to stop the dangerous men. Men are dangerous to like this reinforcing thing, where the logic of extremism, the logic of the thing says, well, it's necessary because that's nature.
Right. Exactly. That gets back to this like biological, like this boys will be boys. This is just the way it is. Right. I mean, we just saw that in these chats that were released, you know, this kind of dismissal of like, well, it's just a joke, or boys will be boys, or it's just that we can't stop them. So it's on us to keep ourselves safe, right? From these, because they're basically predators. And then that narrative just makes men mad, of course, because that's not true for most men. There might be a handful of bad actors out there, but it's not, you know, it's not the norm. And so framing it that way just contributes, I think, to that sense that men are dangerous, and women have to be protected from them. Right?
Thank you. I think there's a really nice callback in here to Jackson Katz's work in Mentors in Violence Prevention around bystander intervention and the kind of roles, and it's kind of back into that call-in thing. But I'm going to take it into the men's workspace to say, you know, it's not, hey dude, that's not all right. Like, hey dude, why was that joke funny? Why do you think that that was funny?
That's not cool.
Do you find that
right?
funny? Like, that's not cool. That kind of that. But then underneath it, if you go to, what are you afraid of? Which is kind of related to the what's it like to be you question.
Right. Exactly.
Because underneath most of this, for most of us guys, is like, well, I don't want to be knocked down a peg. I've been bullied enough. I like all of the things, like I have to stay in my lane, or I'm afraid, like the relationships that I have, I feel like I don't have any power most of the time.
Yeah. And I think as Mark Green that was saying to me at one point, a man I was talking to was saying that, you know, he felt like he'd spent his whole life chopping off pieces of himself as a kid, right? In order to fit into this, in order to be safe from the bullying and violence of other men and the social pressure. And just like, you learn to, you know, smooth out the edges, to not stand out, to be, you know, to fit into this stoicism and dominance and aggression and don't ask for help. Right. And I mean, all the things. Right. And then suddenly someone comes and tells you that's toxic, right? Like that's, you know, what you're doing is toxic. So that's hard, right? I mean, it's hard work, and you're doing right to open yourself back up to
how
these
is that
things.
Toxic? This is what I've done to survive. This is what I do to survive every
this
day.
Was safety, right? This was safety. And so now, of course, it feels unsafe, because you've been taught that this is the way to stay safe, right? And so, of course, it feels vulnerable and scary and unsafe to open that box back up. And we know what happens when you don't open that box back up is that you become more vulnerable to, you know, and you live less life, you know, less years, right? Like these outcomes aren't very good for men either, right? Isolation, the loneliness, the lack of connection, the intense amounts of time online, especially now. And, you know, that all the things that you've carved off, you know, and now to try to build them back in, that's the work of the men's world, really, and the men's wellness world. And it's hard. And I think women have not seen that either. I think I've spent a lot of time talking to boys and men who've told me these things, but I think a lot of women only see the outcome, which is, you know, feels like either threatening or dangerous or could be, because it's true. One of the things I was explaining to a guy friend of mine about the bear. Remember the bear story last summer? Right. And a lot of men one of my friends got really upset by it. And he said, look, you know, what women don't understand. Cause I said, look, I would choose the bear too, like 100 times over. And he got so upset, and he's like, but why don't women understand that there's so many guys who would fight the bear, you know, like the good guys, like standing on the edge, ready to fight, ready to defend. And I said, well, how are we supposed to know which guy is which, right? Like, I don't know if it's the good guy or the bad guy. I know what a bear is going to do. It's predictable, right? And so like, it's facetious and it's a joke, but it was a really important thing for us to have that conversation, to understand why he was offended and upset and hurt by it, because he feels like he's not that guy. And yet women assume he is from the way he looks, right? As a big guy. And I said, look, you could never know which one is which. And so, it's this unpredictability, especially because most women have had some bad experience in the past that leads it to that, leads it to assume that. So I think one of the most important things we can do is have these conversations. Men have to have the conversations in the men's world, of course. Women already have these conversations all the time. It's always been a part of, our lives, I think, and the luck of having been raised in a way that allows us to continue to have those intimate conversations with each other. And so, that's curled up in our pajamas on the couch talking about all kinds of things. We get to do that. And I think it's been a huge benefit to women's relationships and sense of intimacy with each other. But we also have to have these conversations between men and women to help each other understand, and between boys and girls, like those teenagers told me.
Yeah. Lovely. So many directions that I could go from where I'm sitting right now. And I think the one that I want to lean into is some of the good stuff that I see happening out there. And I'll invite you to that too. There are men who are recognizing in the space, and we've been talking about Mark Green, but there are a lot of influencers out there. There are a lot of social media folks out there now, men who are leaning in to say, hey, you know what would be really strong? Hey, you know what'd be really brave? Hey, you know what'd be really courageous? When we are willing to stand up in these spaces and have these difficult conversations and own the vulnerabilities that we feel and own how the system impacts us and own what we're doing to change it. And then still approach the conversation across gender and with women from a place of humility and from a place of, I'm not entitled to your trust walking in the door.
Yeah. No, it's amazing. I mean, some of like what Jackson Katz, I think, has done so well with some of his trainings
for 40 years.
Yeah,
for
right.
More than
exactly.
40 years. Yeah.
I think he does this thing, or somebody does it in these trainings that I think it comes from Jackson is, like ask women, for example, if you ask women what they would do if they were invisible for 24 hours, right? And like the list of things that women say, range. Usually it's like the most common one is that they'd go running, in the woods, in the dark, like they'd go through a park, take the shortcut, right? Like that they'd have the freedom to move around wherever they wanted, however they wanted, with headphones in, without thinking, right? And the second most common is like wear whatever they want, right? So they wear whatever they want, as little clothing as they wanted, or without thinking about how that was being received or what they were, or to be sexualized. And men, it's like, they'd like steal something, most of them, right? I mean, so it's like a totally different set of answers. But when you tell men the answers that women have given to that, it's a pretty transformative thing, I think, because it's so, and it's back to this like total normalization. Like I have, also thought that way my whole life and didn't even think about it. It just becomes what you do. You don't go through the park, certainly not in the dark, only on a trail where there's going to be other people around, right? Like you have all these little ways that shape your daily choices. And I think that kind of understanding that, and then men who are standing up and trying to change the narrative on that, in part by starting to understand the experience that people have who are not the same as them, is a huge leap forward. So I do think, and I hope that the algorithms will support that, right? Because I think that that's the other problem is it salacious enough? Is it outrageous enough? Can we get it? Can we change things in a way that those things can go viral too?
Yes. Thank you. We're getting to the top, and I want to make sure that I bring it into the frame because I think this is going to entice a lot of people to actually go and get the book and read the book.
Right.
I want you to put your framework of the 5 strategies of misogynistic control into the room so that this is like, oh, there's a whole lot here.
Yeah. So what I did was categorize these different approaches. So the first is, remembering that misogynistic strategies are a tactic of law enforcement, of the patriarchy, right? These are strategies to enforce the gendered norms and expectations. They are acted on men as well as women, boys as well as girls.
Yes.
And so the first is containment. And I talk about containment as keeping women in their place, keeping boys in their place. That's the slurs, a lot of the slurs of, when you're doing your gender badly, and keeping LGBTQ people like in the closet. That's a lot of ways that we, tell people stop being front and center, to get back in the kitchen, to send them back, lock her up, right? Like all of these metaphors of actually trying to keep people contained, and trying to police what they're doing, right? So that's where a lot of the slurs and the homophobia, the homophobic slurs come from too for boys. And I talk about the pathways from those ordinary ways into more extreme versions, including through self-help searches, which can be such a positive thing to do, but often can land you on an influencer who offers really bad advice. So containment is one, punishment is another, and that's mostly the male supremacist and violent incel spaces, the real manosphere content. And then there's entitlement, which we talked about. That's a little bit of that. Exploitation was the third one. So there's punishment. So containment, punishment, exploitation. That's where I talked about the sex trafficking and child sexual abuse. That was a really hard chapter to write. And then there's erasure, which is the erasure of mostly LGBTQ folks, legislatively, but also book banning comes up there. And then the fifth one is enabling, and that's a chapter about white women, in particular white women's roles in enforcing this, but also all women, white women, particularly as it gets into some of the movements to challenge demographic change, pro-natalist. There's something called the White Baby Challenge, which is, trying to get women to have as many white babies as this woman had, which is 6. So talking a little bit about the weaponization of motherhood to support some of these violent outcomes as well. So those are the 5. It's containment, punishment, exploitation, erasure, and enabling.
And there's chapters for every single one of them with extensive kind of examples, explanations, research base, all of the kind of statistical analysis of what's out there. And I think, and you can also see, it's easy for me to make the leap into Kimberly Crenshaw's work around intersectionality from here, right? Like this is not just that there's a whiteness aspect to this. There's a class aspect to this. There's all of these there's a capitalist and consumerism and consumption aspect to this, all of these interactive systems, all playing into this.
Yeah, it's a through line. And, when I opened the conclusion with an anecdote, when I was talking to a funder, who I said I was writing a new book on misogyny, and he said, and, I don't name him. He's a great, he's a good, important funder in the field, but he says, misogyny. He's like, well, what does that have to do with extremism? It's not as if these guys want to eliminate women from the face of the earth. And so, I thought, okay, this is really interesting, because if elimination is the only standard, and if you are working on anti-Semitism or white supremacist extremism, you could, that is basically, it is elimination, and it's remigration, or it's somehow suppression or violent suppression or creating a white ethno state. I mean, these fantasies, and all of those things still require women to reproduce the nation, right?
Yes.
But elimination isn't the only standard by which we should measure harmful kinds of things. And so there's also suppression, there's control, there's, belittling, exploitation. I mean, all these the containment, right? All these other erasure, the erasure of rights. And so, there's all that kind of stuff happening too. And so that's sort of made me realize, like, the field, even really, really good people in the field, who are doing this work and funding this work, don't see it, because the standard has been, if you're not trying to build the Holocaust, or you're not trying to exploit people like slavery, then that's not real exploitation. And I think understanding how all these other things. And of course, those are the worst things imaginable, right?
Yes.
Genocide, and enslavement. But we have these other sets of things that are so ubiquitous that also contribute to violent extremism and political violence, and we're not really acknowledging them. So that's the point. And hopefully the book presents it in a way that is a calling in and of men to be a part of the solution, and really probably the biggest part of the solution in terms of reframing how boys grow up and opening up spaces for things to be different.
Thank you. It's kind of a call to me, how this activates me, how the book activated me. It's a call to get out of freeze.
Yeah.
And into kind of exploration, and not jump from freeze to fight.
Yeah.
So much either, but it's just like, okay, get unfrozen.
Yeah, get unfrozen. I think I love that. And, one of the things I'm loving about the reception of the book is that everywhere I go, I'm in conversation with someone really different, right? So like it was Mark Green and Ted Bunch in New York on a couple of different occasions. In Seattle, it's Jen Barnes, who owns the women's sports bar there called Rough and Tumble. And so there, I'm hoping that we'll have a bunch of people, WNBA players and folks who are fans, right, talking about, because there's been a bunch of misogyny in sports.
Yeah.
And so there's so many different ways to have this conversation that involves like sports, that involves national security, that involves, tonight I'm in conversation with Elise Nelson, who's co-founded Vital Voices, which is really a women's equity, gender equity organization globally. And so, the policymakers are interested, but so are the men's wellness world and men's work worlds. And so are the athletes, and, and hopefully we can get everybody on board. Parents, of course, are like one of the first questions I always get is somebody raises their hand and says, like, I have a 15-year-old son, I have a 13-year-old, I have a 17-year-old. Like, everybody wants to talk as a parent or a grandparent. So everybody can come on board from those perspectives too. And to me, that's actually really hopeful. This is a conversation that touches every single person in the room in some way. And that means there's no turning away once you've seen it. There's that unfreezing has to happen, because there are really clear action steps that we can all take that aren't that hard. They're hard to do because it's easy to look away, but they're not that actually hard to start, right? They're just hard to keep going and to be committed to.
Yeah. Thank you. And in the kind of what's in it for me kind of thing, what do you see as what's in it for us to actually do this work?
I mean, I get back to this like data point that says, as of 2 weeks ago, the number one issue that Americans are most concerned about is political violence and political division. First time I think I can ever remember that it hasn't been the economy. It doesn't mean the economy is not important in people's minds. They're also worried about that. But for the first time ever, we're most worried about political violence and political divisions. And we know that the biggest predictor, or among the top three predictors of that, is either hostile sexism or misogyny. So one, we can address political violence this way. We can reduce the likelihood that it happens if we address some of these attitudes and behaviors at the more interpersonal level early on, and the systems that support it and ignore it. But I also think interpersonally, when I think about those two 16-year-olds, how powerful it was for them to just see each other, to see and hear each other's experiences. It was transformative for everybody who heard the two of them, including me. And, I can't wait to go back and see what they've done in the last year. They were juniors, so they'll be seniors now. And, what happened in that club? What happens in those conversations? Like, we have, a school in DC that created a consent summit. We have a school in DC that created a porn summit for parents, right?
Wow.
Really uncomfortable, right?
Yeah.
But I sat in it to see what was happening in it. And, that started to educate parents about violent porn and what's happening with choking behaviors and stroke rates among young women and all this kind of stuff. Like that, you can, it's everything in our lives. It's our relationships, our marriages, our children, our parenting strategies. And it's the way we live our lives and our friendships, our relationships, and our physical and mental well-being, especially for men who are more prone to loneliness, isolation, and to bad health outcomes and shorter lifespans. in part because of all of these things, that they don't stay connected and they don't ask for help and don't go to the doctor, and they are stoic and can soldier through it. So, if you can interrupt all of those things and fix political violence while we're at it, like, why wouldn't we?
Why wouldn't we? Yes, all of that. And, to make the incredibly complex really simple, this is kind of my parenting advice, but it's also like directly from men's group, right? To just sit down next to my kid or to sit down next to a guy and say, wow, this is pretty hard and scary, isn't it?
Yes, right. To validate people's experiences, right? As men, as women, as human beings, as, kids have created a whole word for it as they grow up, which is called adulting, right? Like, right. I love that word, right? Oh my God, adulting is hard.
Yeah.
Well, there's gendered versions of adulting that are hard too, right?
Yeah.
And learning what the world expects of you and then trying to challenge that is hard. And also it's essential.
Yes. It's hard, and also it's essential. There we go. Cynthia Miller-Idriss, thank you so much for spending this time with me. I will put links down below to the website. And is there anything that you just want to shout out to say, hey, go chase this right now?
Yeah, I would just, I'd say chase our website for free downloadable resources too. We have a guide called Not Just a Joke, which helps explain some of the manosphere stuff that kids are getting and what to do about it, with resources for kids, for teachers, for mental health counselors, faith leaders. All of our tools are free. We get the funding and then we make them free, but we test them first to make sure that they help people be more confident, more informed, more aware, more willing to engage with young people. So you're not alone in this quest. There's lots of us trying to create tools, and there's an email to peril at american.edu, which we can drop in the content and in the chat notes as well. And so if anything comes up and people have questions, they can just shoot us an email and see if we can get somebody out to your school or your community as well.
And is the Peril website at american.edu?
Yeah, so we do have an american.edu website, but we have a community-facing one, which is where all the tools are. It's perilresearch.com. So www.perilresearch.com, because it's much easier for us to update the community website and get the tools updated there.
Perilresearch.com. Thank you again. This has been enlivening and educational. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Boysen. Thanks for having me.
This has been the Mankind Podcast, produced in association with the Mankind Project USA. And of course, I want to thank you, the listener, because through your attention and your support, you make it a heck of a lot easier for us to let men out there in the world know that they are not alone and that there is more than one way to be a man. And if you've been enjoying the music throughout this episode and all of our episodes, check out Jim, Donovan, and the Sun King Warriors. I have links to them in the show notes. Now, the fee for this episode is simple. If you found gold and insights that you believe could benefit your loved ones and those you care about, be sure to share it with them. And of course, remember that life doesn't happen to us, it happens for us, so long as we rip the pen out of fate's hand and become the author of our own story. So my friend, pick up the pen and we'll see you next week. Lots of love.
Hey, it's Boysen. On the Mankind Podcast, we've brought some incredible guests on to talk about the importance of doing the work to improve our mental and emotional health. And here's the truth. Multiple times over the last 25 years, I've had the help of one-on-one work with some amazing therapists. For me, for my wife, for both of us as adoptive parents, and for our kids. The Mankind Project and Men's Group, though awesome, are not a substitute for professional mental health support. And so I'm thrilled that the Mankind Podcast now has BetterHelp as a sponsor for the show. BetterHelp works online. It asks you what you're working on and then matches you for live one-on-one sessions with a licensed therapist, someone trained to work with you, listen, and offer helpful insights. I'm using BetterHelp. It's super easy, and I like what I'm getting. If getting one-on-one support in the comfort of your own space feels like a good direction for you, I invite you to check it out. Go to the link in the show notes or betterhelp.com/mankind. And if you sign up, you'll get 10% off your first month of therapy.